Oh, my favorite topic, counter steering. In 1969, I discovered counter steering. It wasn't even a thing. I don't even think anybody was using the term counter steering at the time. I learned it on a bicycle. I was just messing around because a guy told me to cross my hands. I used to ride a track bike on the street, a fixed wheel track bike, like the velodrome thing. And he's trying to make me crash. It told me to ride with my hands crossed for more speed and power. I almost crashed. But in that process, I learned counter steering because I said, "Whoa!" When I turn the wheel this way, the bike goes that way. That's interesting. And so since I used to ride a motorcycle, I used to sneak it out at night at the time because I was underage. I applied it to the motorcycle riding, and for 20 years, I was telling people about counter steering. I didn't call it counter steering. I just said if you turn the handlebars to the left, you go to the right. You know that almost everybody thought I was crazy. They told me I was trying to make them crash. And fast forward to actually that did not really change until about 2003 or 4. And then it flipped because Motorcycle Safety Foundation and similar classes were teaching counter steering. And there was a name for it, and it made sense, and it got very widespread. Now, in 2020, when I tell people there are other ways to turn a motorcycle besides counter steering, they look at me like I'm crazy. They say I don't know what I'm talking about. I had the good fortune of attending two highly respected track schools. One is focused more on street riding, but using the track as the venue. The other one is focused more on track and even racing. And what I found was that these two schools had a different thought when it came to steering. So I started really going deep into this understanding of if you don't use counter steering to turn, what are you using? And the other one is called body steering, but it's a lot to unpack. Having the good fortune of 19 different models at my disposal to ride where and when I wanted to break them all in, did about 1,500 miles on each model that I owned. And in experimenting across those models, I learned quite a bit about how turning a motorcycle. So first, let me tell you this. I use both counter steering and body steering. And I can tell you there are times when you absolutely should not use counter steering. And there are times when you probably should not rely on body steering. But having the two in your repertoire makes a lot of sense. And then I'm going to add in trail braking because that's another way to change the arc. So first, let's do a quick definition thing. Steering, I'll call turning the handlebars. Turning, I will call making the arc. Now, if you ask me, what is the best way to turn a motorcycle? Counter steering or body steering, I will tell you flat out, neither one. The best way to turn a motorcycle is to get it to lean. That's right. If you take a coffee cup and you lay it on its side, a tapered styrofoam coffee cup, and you lay it on its side and roll it, it goes in a circle. That coffee cup is a similar shape to the right half or the left half of your tire. When you lean a motorcycle, you are leaning the wheels, which means you're leaning the tires. And if you look at a close up of a race bike where they take that shot of the slick where it's the tires deflected and it's flat, you can see that's like a coffee cup. And the smaller diameter is going to cover less ground than the larger diameter, which is what makes it go in a circle, which is why the motorcycle turns. The motorcycle doesn't turn right because I turned it left. The motorcycle leans right because I turned it left. And because it's leaning right, it goes right. Now, why is it so complicated? Well, it's not. It's because a lack of definition, but I discovered something else in doing my research to articulate this. And my assumption is that in order for some of the earlier books to get past the committees to be published, they had to meet the standards of physicists and engineers. There's a little known problem that words like deceleration don't exist in physics, nor does centrifugal force. So if I wanted to explain countersteering as if I turn to the left, the centrifugal force makes the bike fall over to the right. I can't do that because centrifugal force does not exist. It's not a term in physics. Now, without getting into it, the way you would explain it in physics, well, when you turn to the left, the motorcycle is now accelerating towards the center that's over there. And when it accelerates towards the center, since it's a single track vehicle, So I'm not going to go down that path, but I've seen some crazy things on the internet about gyroscopic procession, which is a thing, and it does have a role in turning the motorcycle, but not in counter steering. I read things where the back gets kicked out, all this stuff people are making up to answer the question. No,
You steer left.
to lean right, you lean right to go right. Now, how many ways can you make the motorcycle lean right? To prove this point, I've ridden my motorcycle down a street and 40 miles an hour or so, which is well above the speed that counter steering is necessary. And I've gotten that motorcycle to turn at least to lean at least 5 different ways. And once it leans, it turns. Now, granted, none of those ways are as effective as counter steering on the track, where you need a quick turn. And the faster you go, the more force you have to apply to the frame in order to get that motorcycle to turn. Totally get it. But it doesn't mean that when you're on the street, the only solution you have is counter steering. So I want to explore some of these other ways. But before I leave, here's when you should not use counter steering. When you're at the margin. So if you're leaned over at the margin, and that margin might be the margin of your head, or it might be the margin of the physics of the motorcycle. Either way, you should not be using counter steering. First of all, you're leaned over this far. And if you want to tighten the arc, and you turn the wheel this way, you're asking to lose the front end. Now, that said, if I want to go from this way and transition to this way, counter steering is the best way to do that, right? I turn the wheel this way, the front end in physics terms accelerates towards this side. And as it accelerates towards this side, it causes the motorcycle to swap over to the other and lean now to the left, which makes me go to the left. Another concept, another time. For now, understand that if you're at the margin, you do not want to use counter steering to tighten the turn. This is where you can drop your shoulder, you can roll off a little bit, you can ease on the brakes, trail braking using the last 1, 2, or 3% of the brake lever movement is very, very slight. You're only trying to scrub off a mile an hour or two. And if your rear is sliding already, if you're sliding the rear, you probably don't want to back off the throttle too much. You got to do that. That's a whole nother skill set. But what I'm telling you, there are times that you do not want to counter steer. And that's already in the documentation of road racing books, because they tell you 1 steering input per turn. So if you're going into turn 3, you're going to do 1 steering input, and that steering input should be the right one to make the apex. Now you can drop your shoulder to tighten the turn, but you're not going to counter steer again to get to that apex. You're going to use some body steering to make that happen. Now, on the other side, what about body steering? Okay, well, first of all, if you're on a dual sport bike on the street, you're not going to be leaned over as much. Dual sport bikes, because of the higher center of gravity, don't need as much lean angle. Same speed, same turn, a dual sport bike uses less lean angle. Get your head wrapped around that. But many people, if you spend a lot of time in the twisties, you've seen the image of the dual sport bike going around the outside of the sport bike. The sport bike is knee down, and the dual sport bike is cruising around the outside like it's a Sunday morning drive. Why? Because of the way the geometry works, which I'll cover in another segment. And there's a very logical reason for it. But that dual sport bike is now in a position, because they're using less lean angle, suspension works better, and they're able to change direction in a minute way. As BMW riders, we tend to like to ride in a staggered formation, a semi-staggered formation, almost front wheel to rear wheel. And I'm in 1/3 of the lane, they're in the other third of the lane, and the middle third is the no man's land where we don't want to ride, because that's where all the debris is. And we're literally using micro counter steering moves as you move through the lanes and keeping that position. It's very, very fluid. It looks great. It's a lot of fun. It's exciting and exhilarating. And it's just something about it. It's that being in formation for 100 miles on some twisty roads and very seldom falling out of it is something to behold. And so there you're using a lot of counter steering to make that happen. In my opinion, body steering does not react fast enough for that. Now, why does body steering work on the track? Or what is body steering? It's beyond the scope of this conversation, but I'll explain a certain situation. I had an R1200 RS. It was an R1200 RS, extremely well-balanced motorcycle, extremely well-balanced. And what I noticed was that when I was going through the twisties, first of all, because it's a heavy bike, it doesn't use as much lean angle as a sport bike, as my S1000 RR did. So one of the things I noticed that I was a little bit sloppy when I wanted to tighten up along the right side of the road. And a right turn, I wanted to nudge up against the yellow line at the edge of the road. And I felt a little sloppy and I didn't have the confidence because when the road dropped off, obviously if I made a mistake the wrong way, it could be bad. So I said, this is a good time to try this body steering thing. And I experimented with a few different things. The one is that I like is pressing on the inside foot peg. Just pressing on the inside foot peg is real precise. Now, I can't tell you that I wasn't putting in some kind of a steering input and pressing on that foot peg. If I was putting in a steering input, I wasn't leading with that. It's sort of like using big muscles to control the little muscles, right? I'm pressing on the foot peg, and so I didn't have a lot of leverage, so I was much more precise. When you have a lot of leverage, it can be a little bit sloppy, right? So pressing on the foot peg worked. Another thing I did was, always tight, bringing the shoulder in, dropping the shoulder down. On a bike with the traditional forks, it reduces your wheelbase. It also pitches the bike forward a little bit, which is going to help you tighten up the turn. But there are things you can start experimenting with. But start with understanding that there's multiple ways you can get a bike to lean. And once you get it to lean, it's going to be turning. Counter steering is one of them. There are others, and I encourage you to try it. Now, here's one that I wouldn't necessarily try, but it's very interesting. I'm in the cage, cruising down the highway, and a guy rides by me on a bike with ape hangers. And I'm not exaggerating. His hands are up here on the ape hangers. He leans over here, looking literally on the side of his arm forward. And I'm wondering, what is he doing? So he rides like this. He's on the gas, and he gets by my car, and he does this, bam. He pulls the motorcycle over, almost looks violent, right? And as he pulled the motorcycle over, what happened? The motorcycle's leaning. So what does a leaning motorcycle do? It turns. Turned in front of me sharply. I mean, like, whoom. And then he goes whoosh and pushes it back. So now he's like this, right? Now he pulls it back the other way and it's back upright. So he's going, bam. And he did it so fast. Did he use counter steering? You could argue he dialed in a little bit, but I would tell you what he did was use a lot of muscle to pull that bike over. And he had the leverage of the high bars to do it. People do that on bicycles too. Start watching and you'll see that people have different ways of getting the motorcycle or a bicycle to lean. And as you think through that, you might add some things to your repertoire. Now, I'll finish with this. The closer you are to the margin, the less variety you have in effective solutions. At the margin, there's less you can do with the throttle, right? There's less you can do with moving around on the bike without it upsetting things. So I understand, and you should understand that as you go faster and as you're closer to the margin, you have less variety. When you have a lot of lean angle to play with, when you're going slower than the top speed of the bike, you have other options that you can use. So when we start talking about some of these things, keep that in mind. And that's another area, by the way, of why there's some seeming controversy with motorcycle handling and information, because people don't always define that what I'm talking about is when you leaned over at the margin, or when you're doing over 100 miles an hour, or when you're doing under 10 miles an hour. So keep that in mind. I'll make sure that as we go through these segments, I put some context around speed and conditions and the type of motorcycle so we understand, because there's things I can do on a sport bike that I wouldn't do on a KTM. There's things I'll do on the KTM that I can't do on the sport bike. And those of you who ride KTMs know why I called out that specific brand instead of a category of bike. Be safe out there.